There is a surprisingly simple way to control a person. You don't need force, you don't need authority, you don't even need influence. All you have to do is control their reactions. If you can trigger someone's anger, you can guide their behavior. If you can provoke their insecurity, you can influence their decisions. If you can disturb their peace with just a few words, you quietly gain power over their mind. And the uncomfortable truth is that most people don't realize how often this happens to them. It happens in conversations. It happens at work. It happens in relationships. It happens every single day. Sometimes all it takes is a sentence. I remember a small moment that made me realize this. It started with a message. A short message. Just a few words. The kind of message that looks harmless at first glance, yet somehow manages to plant a seed of tension in your mind. It said, "We need to talk tomorrow." That was it. No explanation. No context. Just that sentence. At first, nothing dramatic happened. But within minutes, my mind began doing what the human mind does best. It started reacting. A small question appeared first. What did I do wrong? Then another thought. Did something happen that I'm not aware of? Then the imagination took over. Maybe I made a mistake earlier in the week. Maybe someone said something about me. Maybe tomorrow's conversation would be uncomfortable. And slowly, almost without noticing, my mood began to shift. Not because of something that had happened, but because of something my mind had imagined. By the evening, the situation had grown much bigger inside my head than it ever was in reality. Thoughts kept returning to the same question. What is this about? It's strange how powerful the mind can be when it starts reacting to uncertainty. One small sentence, and the brain begins constructing entire stories. Stories about problems that might not exist. Stories about conflict that hasn't happened. Stories about outcomes that are completely imaginary. The next morning finally arrived. The conversation happened, and it lasted less than 5 minutes. No conflict, no criticism, no hidden issue. It was simply a quick discussion about something practical. Nothing more. And in that moment, something became very clear. The problem had never been the message. The problem had been my reaction. And once you start noticing this pattern, you begin to see it everywhere. A comment from a coworker that irritates you. A disagreement that escalates into an argument. A message that ruins your mood for the rest of the day. Often, the situation itself is small, but the reaction is powerful. Because reactions happen automatically, the human brain is designed to react quickly. It reacts to tone. It reacts to words. It reacts to uncertainty. But what most people never stop to ask is this. What if reacting immediately is actually the moment we lose control? Think about the calmest person you know. The one who never seems rushed into emotional reactions. When people criticize them, they remain steady. When tension appears, they stay composed. When others become emotional, they remain calm. There is something quietly powerful about that kind of person. They don't dominate conversations. They don't react to every provocation. Yet somehow, they hold a kind of authority. A quiet authority. Over time, I began to notice something interesting. The people who handled difficult situations best were not always the smartest in the room. They weren't always the most confident, either. But they had learned something most people never practice. They had learned how to pause. They had learned how to create a small space between what happens and how they respond. Inside that space, something remarkable exists. Choice. The choice to remain calm. The choice to think clearly. The choice to respond instead of react. And that small difference can completely change the way a person moves through the world. Because once you understand how reactions work, you start seeing the world differently. You begin to notice how often people try to provoke reactions through criticism, through pressure, through emotional tension. And you also begin to notice how powerful it is to remain unaffected. Calmness is often misunderstood as passivity. But in reality, calmness is control. Control over attention. Control over emotion. control over the direction of your mind. And that control is one of the most powerful forms of strength a person can develop. In this audiobook, we're going to explore something that sounds simple, but quietly transforms the way you experience life. The power of not reacting. Not as avoidance, not as suppression, but as a deliberate skill. A skill that allows you to protect your peace, maintain clarity, and move through difficult situations with a steady mind. Because sometimes the strongest response is no reaction at all. Chapter 1. The silent habit that controls most lives. There is a habit that quietly shapes the lives of most people. It is so common that we rarely question it. It happens automatically, often before we even realize it. The habit is simple: reacting. A comment appears, and we react. A message arrives, and we react. Someone disagrees with us, and we react. Most of the time it happens instantly. Almost like a reflex. Someone raises their voice, and your tone changes. Someone criticizes you, and your mind begins defending itself. Someone ignores you, and a quiet feeling of irritation begins to grow. None of this feels unusual. In fact, it feels normal. But when you start paying attention, something interesting becomes clear. Much of human behavior is not actually thoughtful response. It is reaction. And reaction has a strange quality. It often feels like control. But in reality, it is the opposite. Because the moment you react automatically, something else is guiding your behavior. A word, a tone, a situation. Instead of choosing how to respond, the situation chooses for you. Imagine two people in the same conversation. One person hears a sharp comment and immediately becomes defensive. Their voice rises. Their thoughts speed up. Their emotions take control. The second person hears the exact same comment, but instead of reacting instantly, they pause. They observe. They consider the situation for a moment before speaking. The difference between these two people may appear small, but over time, it creates completely different lives. One person is constantly pulled into emotional storms. Arguments escalate. Misunderstandings grow. Stress follows them from one situation to the next. The other person moves through the same world with more stability. They do not get dragged into every emotional moment. They remain steady. And because of that steadiness, people often treat them differently. There is something about calmness that changes how others perceive you. When someone reacts quickly, people see emotion. When someone remains composed, people sense control. This is why reacting has such an invisible influence on our lives. It determines how we appear to others. It shapes our relationships. It affects how we handle pressure, criticism, and uncertainty. And yet, most people never examine it. Reacting feels natural. In many ways, the human brain is designed for it. For thousands of years, quick reactions helped our ancestors survive. If danger appeared, hesitation could be deadly. So, the brain developed systems that respond instantly to threat. But modern life is not the same environment. Most of the situations we face today are not life or death. They are social, a disagreement, a misunderstanding, an uncomfortable moment in a conversation. Yet the brain still reacts as if every situation requires immediate action. This is why small things can feel surprisingly intense. A message with a slightly cold tone. A delayed response. A comment that feels dismissive. Even when the situation is minor, the mind can react as if something serious has happened. And when reactions accumulate throughout the day, they slowly drain our mental energy. Think about how often a small moment can linger in the mind. A conversation that keeps replaying. A comment that stays with you long after it was spoken. A situation you wish you had handled differently. These moments often grow larger in our minds than they ever were in reality. Not because of the situation itself, but because of the reaction that followed. The mind replays the event, analyzes it, adds emotional weight to it, and before long, something small becomes something heavy. But there is another path that becomes available once you begin noticing this pattern. You begin to realize that not every situation deserves an immediate reaction. Not every comment requires a defense. Not every disagreement needs to become an argument. Sometimes the strongest move is simply to observe, to let the moment pass without feeding it emotional energy. This does not mean becoming passive or indifferent. It means becoming deliberate. Instead of reacting automatically, you begin to respond intentionally. You begin to notice when emotions rise. You begin to see the moment where a reaction wants to take control. And in that moment, something subtle but powerful happens. You pause. It may only last a few seconds, but in those seconds, the entire situation can change. Because the moment you pause, the reaction loses some of its power. The situation becomes clearer, your thoughts slow down, and suddenly, you are no longer being pulled by the moment. You're choosing how to move within it. At first, this may seem like a small shift, but over time, it becomes something much larger. Because a life built on reactions often feels chaotic. A life built on deliberate responses feels stable. One is controlled by external triggers. The other is guided by internal clarity. And that difference begins with something most people overlook. A habit so quiet that it often goes unnoticed. The habit of reacting. Once you start seeing it clearly, you begin to understand something important. Much of the emotional turbulence people experience is not caused by the world itself. It is caused by how quickly we react to it. The moment you begin slowing down those reactions, you begin reclaiming a surprising amount of control over your life. Chapter 2. Why your brain is addicted to reacting. If reacting often creates stress, conflict, and loss of control, an obvious question appears. Why do we do it so often? Why does the mind react so quickly, even when reacting usually makes situations worse? The answer lies deep inside the way the human brain evolved. Long before modern society existed, our ancestors lived in an environment where survival depended on speed. Danger did not send warnings. A sudden movement in the bushes could mean a predator. A loud sound could mean a threat. A hostile stranger could mean danger. In those moments, thinking slowly could be deadly. So the brain developed a system designed to react instantly. Deep inside the brain sits a small structure called the amygdala. Its job is simple: detect threats and trigger immediate emotional responses. When something feels threatening, the amygdala activates before the rational part of the brain has time to analyze the situation. This process is incredibly fast. It happens in fractions of a second. Before logic appears, the reaction has already begun. Heart rate increases, muscles tighten, attention narrows. The body prepares to respond. This system was extremely useful in the ancient world, but modern life presents a different kind of challenge. Most of the threats we encounter today are not physical. They are emotional or social. A critical comment, a disagreement in a meeting, a sarcastic remark, a message that sounds cold or dismissive. To the rational mind, these situations are not dangerous. But to the emotional brain, they can feel surprisingly similar to threat. And when the brain senses threat, the reaction system activates automatically. You might feel irritation before you understand why. You might defend yourself before you have fully heard what the other person said. You might respond emotionally before logic has time to intervene. This is sometimes called an amygdala hijack. The emotional brain takes control before the thinking brain can participate. But biology is only part of the story. Modern life has added something new to the equation: a constant stream of stimulation. Phones vibrate with notifications. Social media delivers opinions and arguments every few seconds. Messages arrive instantly and demand immediate replies. These systems are designed to provoke reactions. A controversial post triggers anger. A disagreement invites a response. A notification creates curiosity. Every reaction produces a small release of dopamine in the brain. Dopamine is often called the brain's reward chemical. It reinforces behaviors. This means that reacting can actually become a habit that the brain learns to enjoy. Even negative reactions can create stimulation. A heated argument may feel stressful, but it also produces emotional intensity. And the brain often becomes attached to that intensity. This is one reason why people sometimes find themselves pulled into arguments they know are pointless, or responding to messages that they know will only create more tension, or revisiting conversations in their mind long after they have ended. The brain has learned to react, and once that pattern is established, it becomes automatic. But something important happens when you begin to understand this mechanism. You realize that reactions are not simply who you are. They are patterns, and patterns can be changed. When you notice the urge to react, you're observing a biological system that evolved for survival. But modern life rarely requires the same level of urgency. Most conversations do not need immediate emotional responses. Most disagreements do not require instant defense. Most situations benefit from something the ancient brain was never trained to do. Pause. That pause allows the rational part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, to step in. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for higher thinking. It analyzes context. It considers long-term consequences. It allows you to choose actions rather than follow impulses. But the prefrontal cortex needs time. If reactions happen too quickly, it never gets the chance to participate. This is why calm individuals often appear more thoughtful. They are not necessarily smarter. They simply allow their thinking brain to engage before reacting. Over time, this creates a noticeable difference in behavior. When tension appears, reactive people escalate it. Calm people stabilize it. When criticism appears, reactive people defend immediately. Calm people observe first. When uncertainty appears, reactive people imagine the worst. Calm people gather more information. These differences may seem subtle, but they shape the way people navigate almost every situation in life. Because reacting quickly may feel powerful in the moment, but the ability to pause is often far more powerful in the long run. And once you begin practicing that pause, something surprising begins to happen. Situations that once felt overwhelming start to feel manageable. Conversations become clearer. Decisions become more deliberate. And the mind slowly begins to move away from automatic reactions toward intentional responses. But there is another important realization waiting just beyond this point. A realization that many people find uncomfortable. Because reacting quickly does more than create stress. In many situations, it quietly gives away something far more valuable. Power. And understanding that dynamic changes the way you see emotional reactions forever. Chapter 3. The strange way reactions give away your power. There is a subtle dynamic that exists in almost every human interaction, though most people never stop to notice it. It is the quiet exchange of power. Power in this sense does not mean authority or status. It does not mean control in an obvious or aggressive way. It simply means influence, the ability to affect what another person thinks, feels, or does. And in many everyday situations, that influence appears in a very simple form. The ability to trigger a reaction. Think about a typical argument. Two people begin with a disagreement. At first, the conversation may be calm, even reasonable. But then, someone says something slightly sharper. A critical remark, a sarcastic comment, a dismissive tone. The other person reacts immediately. Their voice rises. Their body language tightens. Their words become defensive. At that moment, something important has already happened. The emotional balance of the conversation has shifted. The person who reacted has lost something subtle but powerful. Composure. And when composure disappears, clarity often disappears with it. The conversation stops being about understanding. It becomes about defending, attacking, and proving a point. The strange thing is that this dynamic appears everywhere. In workplaces, one employee receives criticism and reacts emotionally. Suddenly, the discussion becomes about their reaction rather than the original issue. In relationships, one partner says something provocative. The other reacts quickly, and the situation escalates into a conflict neither person originally intended. Even on social media, Someone posts an opinion designed to provoke strong reactions. The more people respond emotionally, the more attention the post receives. In each of these situations, reactions create momentum. And momentum can be guided. People who understand this dynamic sometimes use it intentionally. A provocative remark to test someone's composure, a dismissive comment to see whether it triggers defensiveness, a subtle insult designed to pull someone into an emotional response. When a person reacts strongly, the reaction itself becomes information. It reveals pressure points. It reveals insecurities. It reveals exactly which emotional buttons can be pushed. This is why reacting quickly can unintentionally give away power. Because reactions show others where your emotional boundaries are fragile. The more predictable your reactions become, the easier it is for others to influence your behavior. But there is something interesting that happens when someone does not react. Imagine the same argument again. A sharp comment appears, but instead of responding immediately, the other person pauses. They do not raise their voice. They do not rush to defend themselves. They simply observe. That moment of calm creates an unexpected shift. The person who delivered the comment suddenly faces silence rather than resistance. And silence often changes the emotional dynamic of the entire interaction. Without a reaction to push against, the conversation loses momentum. The tension that was meant to escalate suddenly has nowhere to go. This is one reason calm individuals often appear more powerful in difficult situations. Not because they dominate others, but because they cannot easily be pulled into emotional turbulence. When someone cannot provoke you, they cannot easily control the direction of the interaction. And this ability, the ability to remain composed under pressure, creates a kind of quiet authority. People begin to notice it. They sense stability. They sense that this person does not move according to the emotional energy of the room. Instead, the room begins to adjust around them. Leaders often display this quality. Not necessarily through loud confidence, but through steady composure. When tension rises, they remain calm. When others become emotional, they slow the pace of the conversation. Their calmness becomes a stabilizing force. And over time, people begin to trust that stability. But this skill does not appear magically. It comes from understanding something very important about reactions. A reaction is not just an emotion. It is a signal that tells the world how easily your internal state can be disturbed. The less control you have over your reactions, the more control external situations have over you. But the opposite is also true. The more control you develop over your reactions, the less influence those situations hold. This does not mean suppressing emotions. It means learning to experience emotions without immediately acting on them. To feel irritation without escalating it. To hear criticism without becoming defensive. To face tension without allowing it to dictate your behavior. At first, this may feel unnatural. Because reacting instantly has been practiced for years, sometimes for an entire lifetime. But once a person begins practicing calm responses, something begins to change. Situations that once felt overwhelming begin to lose their intensity. Conflicts become easier to navigate. And interactions that once drained energy start to feel manageable. The ability to remain calm does not eliminate challenges, but it changes your relationship with them. And the moment you begin to notice how reactions influence power dynamics, you start seeing the world in a different way. You begin to recognize when people are trying to provoke reactions. You begin to notice when tension is being used to push you into emotional responses. And most importantly, you begin to understand how powerful it can be to remain steady in those moments. Because when reactions disappear, something else quietly appears. Authority. Not the loud kind, but the quiet kind that people instinctively respect. And that quiet authority begins with a simple shift in awareness. The understanding that emotional reactions are not always necessary. And that sometimes, the most powerful response is composure. Chapter 4. Why calm people hold invisible authority. If you observe people carefully, you will notice something interesting. In tense situations, not everyone loses control. Some people remain surprisingly calm. A heated conversation begins. Voices grow louder. Emotions rise. Yet one person in the room stays composed. They listen. They speak slowly. They do not rush to defend themselves. And something unusual happens in that moment. The atmosphere of the room begins to change. People lower their voices. The pace of the conversation slows. Attention shifts toward the person who remains calm. This is the beginning of what can be called invisible authority. Authority that does not come from titles, status, or power, but from emotional stability. Think about a chaotic meeting. Several people are arguing. Everyone wants to speak. Everyone wants to prove they are right. But one person waits. They observe the room. They allow others to speak first. Then, when they finally say something, the room becomes quiet. Not because they demanded silence, but because their calm presence creates it. This phenomenon appears in many areas of life. In workplaces, in leadership, in relationships, even in everyday conversations. People who remain calm during emotional situations often gain more influence. Not because they dominate others, but because calmness signals something powerful. Control. When someone reacts quickly, others see emotion. When someone remains steady, others sense discipline. And discipline often inspires trust. Because if a person can manage their own emotions, people assume they can manage difficult situations as well. This is one reason why experienced leaders rarely rush into emotional reactions. They understand that the emotional tone of a room spreads quickly. If they react with anger, the entire environment becomes tense. If they react with calmness, the environment stabilizes. Calmness is contagious, but calmness also requires strength. It requires the ability to tolerate discomfort without immediately trying to eliminate it. Imagine someone criticizing you in front of others. The instinctive reaction might be to defend yourself immediately, to explain, to correct them, to argue. But a calm person might do something different. They listen first. They allow the criticism to exist for a moment. They evaluate whether the criticism contains truth. And only then do they respond. Sometimes the response is measured. Sometimes the response is brief. And sometimes, the response is silence. What surprises many people is how powerful silence can be. Silence creates space. And space interrupts emotional momentum. When someone expects a reaction but receives calmness instead, they often lose their emotional leverage. The conversation resets, and the person who remained calm naturally appears more grounded. This is why calm individuals often gain respect without actively trying to demand it. Their composure signals reliability. Their steadiness signals confidence. And confidence that does not need to prove itself tends to feel authentic. Over time, people begin to recognize this pattern. When tensions rise, they look toward the calm person. When decisions need to be made, they trust the person who thinks before reacting. And gradually, influence begins to shift. The calm person becomes a stabilizing force. Not through authority imposed from the outside, but through composure developed from within. This is why emotional control is often misunderstood. Many people associate strength with intensity, with speaking louder, with reacting faster. But real strength often appears in the opposite form. The ability to remain steady when others are not. The ability to think clearly when emotions are rising. The ability to choose your response instead of surrendering to impulse. These qualities create something rare. A presence that feels grounded. A presence that feels difficult to disturb. And people naturally respect individuals who cannot easily be shaken. But it is important to understand something. Calmness does not mean the absence of emotion. Calm people feel frustration. They feel disappointment. They feel anger just like everyone else. The difference is not what they feel. The difference is what they do with those feelings. Instead of reacting instantly, they observe. Instead of escalating situations, they stabilize them. Instead of letting emotions take control, they maintain awareness. And this awareness gradually becomes a form of quiet power. Not loud, not aggressive, but unmistakable. The kind of power that appears when someone knows they do not need to react to every situation. And once you begin recognizing this quality in others, you may notice something else. The most respected people in difficult environments often share this trait. They do not move with every emotional current. They move with intention. They remain steady when situations become unpredictable. And that steadiness becomes the foundation of their influence. Because the ability to remain calm does something important. It changes the emotional gravity of the room. Instead of being pulled by tension, you begin to anchor the situation. And once a person becomes that anchor, their presence carries weight. Not through force, but through stability. Yet calm authority does not appear automatically. It comes from practicing something that most people rarely do. Learning how to experience emotions without being controlled by them. And that skill is where the real transformation begins. Because calmness is not simply a personality trait. It is a discipline, one that can be developed, strengthened, and refined over time. And the people who master that discipline begin to move through life in a very different way. Not reacting to every wave of emotion, but navigating above it. Chapter 5. The rare skill of people who stay calm under pressure. If calmness creates authority and reacting too quickly gives away control, an important question naturally follows. Why are some people able to stay calm in situations where others lose composure? Why do certain individuals remain steady during criticism, tension, or conflict, while others react instantly? At first glance, it might seem like a personality trait. Some people appear naturally calm. Others appear naturally emotional. But when you observe closely, something different becomes clear. Calmness under pressure is not simply a personality. It is a skill, and like most skills, it can be practiced. The difference between someone who reacts instantly and someone who remains composed often comes down to one simple ability. The ability to separate emotion from action. This does not mean eliminating emotions. In fact, calm individuals feel emotions just like everyone else. They feel irritation when someone speaks disrespectfully. They feel frustration when situations become unfair. They feel tension when uncertainty appears. The difference is not in what they feel. The difference is what they do in the moment those emotions appear. Most people experience emotion and immediately act on it. Emotion becomes reaction. Anger becomes words. Frustration becomes argument. Embarrassment becomes defensiveness. But people who remain calm have trained themselves to create a small distance between emotion and behavior. When a feeling appears, they notice it. But they do not immediately allow that feeling to control their response. Instead, they observe it. This small moment of observation is extremely powerful. Because it interrupts the automatic chain of reaction. Emotion arises, but action waits. That brief space between feeling and response allows something important to happen. Awareness enters the situation, and awareness changes everything. Imagine a situation at work. A manager criticizes a project you worked on for weeks. The words are sharp. The criticism feels unfair. In that moment, irritation appears instantly. Your mind prepares to defend itself. But a calm person does something slightly different. They notice the feeling first. They recognize the irritation rising. And instead of reacting immediately, they allow a moment of silence. They listen. They let the criticism finish. They ask themselves a quiet question. Is there something useful in this feedback? Sometimes the answer is yes. Sometimes the answer is no. But because they paused, they respond more intelligently. The reaction becomes a choice instead of an impulse. This process may sound simple, but it requires practice. Because emotions move quickly, the brain prefers immediate responses. And in stressful moments, that instinct becomes even stronger. But people who stay calm under pressure have developed habits that strengthen their awareness. One of those habits is learning to observe emotions without immediately identifying with them. For example, instead of thinking, "I'm angry," They might recognize, anger is appearing right now. This small shift in perspective may seem subtle, but it creates psychological distance. When you say, "I'm angry," the emotion feels like your identity. When you observe, "Anger is appearing," the emotion becomes something you are experiencing rather than something you are controlled by. That difference gives you space. And in that space, you regain control over your behavior. Another habit calm individuals develop is slowing the pace of their responses. In tense conversations, people often feel pressure to respond immediately. Silence feels uncomfortable, so they fill it quickly. But calm people understand something important. Silence is not weakness. Silence is thinking. When someone pauses before speaking, they give themselves time to organize their thoughts. They prevent emotional impulses from shaping their words. And in many cases, the pause itself changes the energy of the conversation. Instead of escalating tension, the situation begins to slow down. Others sense the calmness and unconsciously mirror it. This is one reason why calm individuals often influence the emotional tone of a room. They introduce stability, and stability spreads. But emotional discipline involves more than simply pausing. It also involves choosing which situations deserve your energy. Not every comment requires a response. Not every disagreement requires correction. Not every criticism deserves attention. People who stay calm under pressure often practice a quiet form of selectivity. They ask themselves a simple question: is this situation worth my emotional energy? Sometimes the answer is yes. But very often, the answer is no. And when the answer is no, they allow the moment to pass without feeding it further attention. This habit protects mental clarity. Because reacting to every situation creates emotional exhaustion. The mind becomes overloaded with tension, conflict, and unnecessary stress. But when you begin selecting your responses carefully, your energy becomes more focused. You respond only when it matters. And when you do respond, your words carry more weight. Another important quality of calm individuals is their ability to remain comfortable with uncertainty. Many emotional reactions come from the desire for immediate clarity. When something feels ambiguous, the mind tries to resolve it quickly. This can lead to premature conclusions. Someone's tone sounds cold, so we assume they are angry. Someone does not, so we assume they are upset. Someone disagrees with us, so we assume they are attacking us. But calm individuals allow uncertainty to exist for a while. They gather more information before reacting. They recognize that first impressions are often incomplete, and this patience prevents many unnecessary conflicts. Over time, these habits transform the way a person navigates difficult situations. Instead of being pulled into emotional turbulence, they remain grounded. Instead of reacting to every trigger, they choose their responses carefully. Instead of escalating tension, they stabilize it. And the longer someone practices this skill, the more natural it becomes. Situations that once provoked strong reactions begin to feel manageable. Conversations that once felt stressful become easier to navigate. Emotions still appear, but they no longer dictate behavior. This transformation creates something that many people admire, but rarely understand. Composure. Composure is not the absence of emotion. It is the presence of awareness. It is the ability to experience feelings without surrendering control to them. And people who develop composure often discover an unexpected benefit. Life becomes quieter, not because the world changes, but because fewer situations trigger emotional storms inside the mind. Criticism becomes information rather than insult. Disagreement becomes discussion rather than conflict. Uncertainty becomes curiosity rather than anxiety. This does not mean life becomes effortless. Challenges still exist, but the mind becomes more stable in the presence of those challenges. And that stability gradually evolves into something powerful. A steady presence, a calm confidence, a quiet strength that others begin to notice. Because in a world filled with constant reactions, someone who remains calm stands out immediately. They feel different, grounded, difficult to disturb. And people naturally trust individuals who appear internally stable. This is why emotional discipline quietly changes the way others perceive you. When you stop reacting impulsively, your words carry more intention. Your presence carries more weight, and your decisions become clearer. But there is still another important step in this transformation. Learning how to develop the one habit that makes this entire process possible. The habit that separates automatic reactions from deliberate responses. A habit so simple that many people overlook it, yet powerful enough to change the direction of an entire conversation. The habit of pausing before responding. And that pause may be the most powerful moment in any interaction. Chapter 6. The small pause that changes everything. There is a moment in every emotional situation that most people never notice. It happens quickly, often so quickly that it disappears before we become aware of it. Yet within that moment lies one of the most powerful abilities a person can develop. The ability to pause. Between what happens and how we respond, there is a space. A small space. A fraction of time between stimulus and reaction. Most people move through that space automatically. Something happens, and the reaction follows immediately. A comment appears, and the response comes instantly. A tone feels disrespectful, and the body reacts before the mind has time to think. But the individuals who remain calm under pressure have discovered something unusual. They expand that space. Instead of moving through it unconsciously, they slow it down. They pause. That pause may last only a few seconds, but it completely changes the nature of the situation. Because reactions are fast, but thoughtful responses require time. Imagine receiving a message that feels confrontational. Perhaps a colleague writes something that sounds critical. Your first instinct might be to reply immediately. Your mind begins forming arguments. Your fingers move quickly across the keyboard. But if you pause before responding, something interesting happens. The intensity of the moment begins to fade. The emotional wave that felt urgent a few seconds ago starts to weaken. You begin to see the situation more clearly. You may notice that the tone was not as aggressive as you first assumed. Or you might recognize that responding emotionally would only escalate the tension. This is the hidden power of the pause. It interrupts emotional momentum. Emotions behave like waves. They rise quickly, peak, and then gradually fall. When people react instantly, they act at the peak of the wave. But when they pause, they allow the wave to pass. And once the wave passes, clarity returns. This is why calm individuals often appear thoughtful. Not necessarily because they think faster than others, but because they refuse to think while emotions are still rising. They wait. They let the emotional surge settle. Then they respond. In conversations, this pause can completely transform the direction of an interaction. Imagine someone making a provocative comment during a discussion. They might expect an immediate reaction, perhaps even hope for one. But instead of reacting, you pause. You breathe. You allow the moment to exist without filling it immediately. That brief silence can feel uncomfortable at first, but it changes the emotional dynamic of the conversation. Instead of escalating tension, the moment slows down. Often the other person begins reconsidering what they said. Sometimes they soften their tone. Sometimes they clarify their intention. And sometimes the conflict dissolves before it even begins. Silence has a surprising effect on conversations. People expect reactions. When reactions do not appear, the energy of the situation shifts. This is why experienced negotiators and skilled communicators use pauses intentionally. They understand that speaking less often creates more impact. When someone pauses before answering a difficult question, their response tends to feel more deliberate. When someone listens quietly before replying, others feel heard. When someone resists the urge to interrupt, the conversation becomes more balanced. The pause gives thinking a chance to catch up with emotion. But the pause is not only useful in conversations with others. It is equally powerful in conversations with yourself. Much of the stress people experience does not come from external events. It comes from the thoughts that follow those events. A small problem appears, and the mind begins constructing scenarios. What if this goes wrong? What if they are upset with me? What if this situation becomes worse? These thoughts often appear instantly. But if you pause and observe them instead of immediately believing them, something interesting happens. The thoughts lose some of their authority. You begin to see them as mental events rather than facts. The mind is simply generating possibilities, not necessarily predicting reality. This awareness prevents many unnecessary emotional reactions. Because thoughts are not commands. They are suggestions. And when you pause long enough to examine them, you gain the ability to decide which suggestions deserve attention. This skill becomes especially valuable in moments of pressure. In high-stress environments, people often feel rushed into decisions. They feel the need to act quickly, to answer immediately, to resolve tension as fast as possible. But rushing often leads to mistakes, and mistakes create new problems. Calm individuals recognize this pattern. They understand that clarity improves when the mind slows down. So, instead of rushing, they pause. They take a breath. They create space between the pressure of the moment and the decision that follows. This habit may appear small, but its effects accumulate over time. In relationships, it prevents unnecessary arguments. In workplaces, it improves decision-making. In personal life, it reduces emotional exhaustion. Because when reactions slow down, life itself begins to feel less chaotic. Situations that once felt overwhelming become manageable. Conversations that once escalated quickly remain balanced. And the mind becomes less reactive to every small disturbance. But like any skill, pausing requires practice. The first step is simply becoming aware of the moment when a reaction begins. The moment irritation appears. The moment defensiveness rises. The moment tension enters the body. Once you notice that moment, you have an opportunity. Instead of reacting immediately, you pause. You take a breath. You allow the emotion to exist without acting on it. This pause does not eliminate the emotion, but it prevents the emotion from controlling your behavior. Over time, this practice strengthens the mind's ability to remain steady. Reactions that once felt unavoidable become optional. And optional reactions are far easier to manage. Eventually, the pause becomes a habit. A natural part of the way you navigate difficult situations. You listen more carefully. You speak more deliberately. You respond with greater clarity. And people around you begin to notice something different. Your presence feels stable. Your responses feel thoughtful. Your reactions feel measured rather than impulsive. In a world where many people react instantly, this quality stands out. It creates trust. It creates influence. It creates the quiet authority that comes from emotional discipline. But the most important transformation happens internally. Because the more you practice pausing, the more you realize something powerful. You are not obligated to react to everything that happens around you. Not every comment deserves your attention. Not every criticism deserves your defense. Not every situation deserves your emotional energy. And once you understand that truth, something remarkable begins to happen. Your mind becomes quieter, not because life becomes easier, but because fewer situations are allowed to disturb your inner stability. The pause becomes a protective boundary between your peace and the chaos of the outside world. And from that boundary, a deeper change begins to emerge. You start becoming someone who cannot easily be controlled by external situations. Someone who moves through tension without losing clarity. Someone whose emotional state is guided by intention rather than impulse. And that transformation leads directly to the next stage of this journey. The moment when calmness stops being just a technique, and becomes part of your identity. Chapter 7. Becoming someone who cannot be easily controlled. At a certain point in this journey, something important begins to change. In the beginning, learning not to react feels like a technique. You remind yourself to pause. You try to stay calm. You consciously practice observing your emotions. It requires effort. You notice the reaction rising, and you deliberately choose not to follow it. But over time, if this practice continues, something deeper happens. The change moves beyond technique. It becomes identity. Instead of trying not to react, you begin to see yourself as someone who simply does not react easily. And this shift in identity quietly changes the way the world interacts with you. Because the moment people realize they cannot easily provoke you, the entire dynamic of many situations changes. Think about how often people test emotional boundaries. Sometimes it happens intentionally. A sarcastic remark in a conversation. A dismissive tone in a meeting. A comment designed to provoke irritation. Sometimes people are not even aware they are doing it. They are simply expressing their own emotions, their own frustrations, their own stress. But when someone senses that their words can trigger a reaction, it often encourages them to push further. Reaction creates momentum. But when a reaction does not appear, that momentum disappears. Imagine someone making a sharp comment in a discussion. They expect a defensive reply. Instead, they receive calmness. No raised voice. No emotional argument. Just a measured response. Or sometimes even silence. In that moment, something unusual happens. The emotional control of the situation shifts. The person who attempted to provoke tension suddenly has nothing to push against. And without resistance, the emotional energy of the moment loses direction. This is one of the reasons calm individuals often appear difficult to manipulate. Manipulation usually relies on emotional reactions. Guilt, anger, fear, insecurity. When these emotions can be triggered easily, influence becomes easier. But when someone remains aware of these triggers, they become far more difficult to control. This does not mean becoming emotionally distant. It means becoming emotionally aware. Aware enough to recognize when someone's words are attempting to create pressure. Aware enough to notice when tension is being used to push you into a reaction. And aware enough to decide whether that reaction is necessary. For example, imagine someone criticizing your decision in front of others. If your identity is built around defending yourself immediately, you may feel compelled to react. You may argue. You may explain. You may try to prove that you are right. But if your identity is built around calmness and awareness, the situation looks different. You recognize the criticism. You evaluate it. You decide whether it deserves a response. Sometimes it does. But sometimes the most powerful response is restraint. A brief acknowledgement. A calm clarification. Or simply letting the comment pass without turning it into conflict. This restraint often surprises people. Because many interactions are built on the expectation of emotional reactions. When someone refuses to participate in that cycle, the entire dynamic shifts. People begin adjusting their behavior around them. They speak more carefully. They approach conversations with more respect. And gradually, they recognize that provoking reactions will not work. This transformation does not happen overnight. It develops slowly as you practice emotional discipline. At first, you simply pause before reacting. Then you begin noticing patterns. You recognize the types of situations that once triggered you easily. You become aware of how certain comments or tones affect your emotions. And instead of resisting those emotions, you observe them. Observation changes your relationship with them. An insult that once provoked anger now becomes information. A criticism that once felt personal now becomes feedback. A tense conversation that once created anxiety now becomes an opportunity to practice calmness. Over time, your emotional landscape becomes more stable. Situations that once disturbed your peace begin to feel manageable. And this stability creates something powerful. Emotional independence. Emotional independence means your internal state is no longer dictated by external events. Someone's opinion does not automatically determine your mood. A disagreement does not automatically trigger conflict. A stressful situation does not automatically overwhelm your mind. Instead, you remain grounded. You experience emotions, but they move through you without taking control. This independence changes the way you move through the world. You stop chasing approval. You stop fearing criticism. You stop feeling the need to react to every comment or situation. And with that, freedom comes clarity. You begin to see situations more objectively. You begin to understand people more easily. You begin to recognize which conflicts are meaningful and which are simply emotional noise. In many ways, this clarity is one of the greatest rewards of emotional discipline. Because once you stop reacting to everything, you gain the ability to focus on what truly matters. Your attention becomes more intentional. Your energy becomes more directed. Your actions become more deliberate. And people around you begin to notice something different. You appear calm in situations that once felt overwhelming. You appear steady in moments where others become emotional. You appear confident without needing to prove it. This quiet confidence creates trust. People feel safe around individuals who are emotionally stable. They know conversations will not suddenly explode into conflict. They know disagreements can remain constructive, and that stability becomes a form of influence. Not because you are trying to control others, but because your calmness stabilizes the environment around you. Eventually, this way of being becomes natural. You no longer think about whether to react. You simply observe situations and respond when it makes sense. And when it does not make sense, you let the moment pass. This ability to let things pass without emotional involvement is surprisingly powerful. Because many situations only gain importance when we react to them. Arguments grow when reactions fuel them. Tension spreads when emotions amplify it. But when calmness enters the situation, the cycle often stops before it can grow. And that is when you realize something important. Not reacting does not mean losing power. In many situations, it is the moment you reclaim it. Because when your reactions are no longer automatic, your life is no longer controlled by every external trigger. Your attention becomes your own. Your emotions become manageable. Your responses become intentional. And slowly, quietly, you become someone who moves through the world with a steady mind. Someone whose inner stability cannot easily be shaken. And that stability becomes the foundation for something even deeper. A way of living where calmness is not something you practice occasionally, but something you carry with you everywhere. Chapter 8. The Quiet Power of a Calm Mind. By the time a person learns to pause before reacting, something inside them begins to shift. At first, the change is subtle. Situations that once felt overwhelming begin to feel manageable. Arguments that once escalated quickly begin to lose their intensity. Comments that once stayed in the mind for hours begin to pass more easily. But over time, something deeper begins to happen. The mind itself becomes quieter. Not because life suddenly becomes easier, but because fewer things are allowed to disturb your internal stability. Most people move through the world in a constant state of reaction. A message arrives and their mood changes. A disagreement appears and their emotions rise. A comment from a stranger lingers in their thoughts for the rest of the day. Their inner state is constantly influenced by external events. But when you stop reacting automatically, something powerful happens. Your internal state becomes more stable. Instead of being pushed in every direction by the world around you, your mind develops a center. And from that center, clarity begins to grow. Clarity is one of the most underestimated benefits of calmness. When emotions dominate the mind, thinking becomes narrow. The brain focuses on defending, proving, arguing, or escaping. But when calmness is present, the mind becomes more spacious. You see more possibilities. You understand people more clearly. You recognize patterns that once went unnoticed. For example, imagine a tense conversation between two people. Both are reacting emotionally. Each person interrupts the other. Each person defends their position. Neither person is truly listening. Now, imagine the same conversation with one person remaining calm. They listen fully. They allow the other person to express themselves. They respond thoughtfully instead of reacting impulsively. Suddenly, the conversation feels completely different. Not because the problem disappeared, but because calmness created space for understanding. This ability to create space is one of the quiet powers of a calm mind. Calmness slows down situations that would otherwise spiral into conflict. It allows conversations to become productive instead of destructive. It allows decisions to become thoughtful instead of impulsive. And over time, this calm presence changes the way others interact with you. People begin to approach you differently. They trust your reactions. They respect your perspective. They sense that you will not escalate situations unnecessarily. In a world where many people react quickly, calmness stands out. It becomes noticeable, and people are naturally drawn to those who remain steady under pressure. But the most important benefit of calmness happens internally. Because when reactions become less frequent, the mind experiences something rare. Peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from escaping challenges, but the kind that comes from understanding that not every situation deserves emotional involvement. You begin to realize that many of the tensions that once consumed your energy were never truly necessary. Many arguments were fueled by impulse. Many worries were fueled by imagination. Many emotional storms were fueled by reactions that could have been paused. Once you see this clearly, the world begins to look different. Situations that once felt urgent begin to feel temporary. Problems that once felt overwhelming begin to feel solvable. And interactions with others become less about defending yourself and more about understanding what is actually happening. This shift changes the quality of your attention. Instead of focusing on emotional noise, your attention becomes focused on what truly matters. You listen more carefully. You observe more clearly. You respond more intentionally. And over time, this clarity becomes a quiet source of confidence. Not loud confidence. Not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that comes from knowing you can remain steady in difficult moments. Confidence that comes from emotional stability. Confidence that does not disappear when situations become uncomfortable. This quiet confidence is often misunderstood. People sometimes assume calm individuals are passive. But calmness is not passivity. Calmness is discipline. It is the discipline of not allowing every external event to control your inner state. It is the discipline of responding thoughtfully instead of reacting impulsively. And that discipline gradually transforms the way you experience life. The world becomes less chaotic. Not because chaos disappears, but because your mind no longer mirrors it. Instead of absorbing every tension around you, you remain grounded. Instead of amplifying emotional situations, you stabilize them. Instead of reacting automatically, you move with intention. And this intention becomes the foundation of a calm mind. A mind that is capable of navigating complexity without becoming overwhelmed. A mind that can experience emotion without being controlled by it. A mind that understands something many people never discover. You do not have to react to everything. You do not have to carry every comment. You do not have to turn every disagreement into conflict. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply remain steady. To observe the situation. To choose your response carefully. Or sometimes to choose no response at all. Because calmness is not the absence of action. It is the presence of awareness. It is the ability to see clearly before moving. And once a person learns to move through life with that awareness, something remarkable happens. Their mind becomes a place of stability rather than turbulence. A place where decisions are made with clarity. A place where emotional storms pass without destroying inner peace. This is the quiet power of a calm mind. A power that does not need to announce itself. A power that does not rely on force. A power that exists simply because the person who carries it has learned something rare. How to remain steady in a world that constantly demands reactions. And once you truly understand that power, you begin to see that calmness is not just a strategy for difficult moments. It is a way of living. There is a moment that eventually arrives for anyone who begins paying attention to their reactions. It is a quiet realization. At first, it feels small. You notice that a situation which once would have irritated you, no longer does. A comment that once would have stayed in your mind for hours, now passes quickly. An argument that once would have escalated, never even begins. And slowly, you begin to see something clearly. Many of the emotional storms that once filled your life were never really about the situations themselves. They were about the reactions that followed them. This realization can feel surprising at first, because for most of our lives, reacting feels natural. When someone criticizes us, we defend ourselves. When someone disrespects us, we feel anger. When something unexpected happens, we rush to respond. But as you begin to observe the mind more carefully, you start to notice something important. Not every situation deserves your reaction. In fact, many situations gain their power only because we react to them. An argument grows because two people react emotionally. A misunderstanding becomes conflict because neither person pauses long enough to listen. A small comment becomes a lingering frustration because the mind keeps replaying it. But when reactions slow down, something interesting happens. The intensity of many situations disappears. Conversations become calmer. Problems become easier to understand. And your mind becomes a quieter place. Not empty, not indifferent, but stable. This stability is one of the most valuable qualities a person can develop because life will always present challenges. People will disagree with you. Situations will not always go as planned. Unexpected moments will appear, but when your mind learns not to react automatically, those moments lose much of their power over you. Instead of being pulled into emotional turbulence, you remain grounded. Instead of reacting impulsively, you respond deliberately. Instead of letting external situations control your internal state, you begin guiding your own responses, and that shift changes everything. Your relationships become healthier. Your conversations become clearer. Your decisions become more thoughtful. But perhaps most importantly, your inner life becomes calmer. You begin to experience fewer unnecessary conflicts, fewer emotional spirals, fewer moments where a small situation grows into something far larger in your mind. You begin to see life with more perspective, more patience, more understanding. And the interesting thing is that people around you begin to notice this change as well. They notice your calmness. They notice your composure. They notice that you do not react the way most people do. And often, they begin to respect that stability. Not because you demand it, but because calmness naturally creates trust. People trust those who remain steady. People feel comfortable around those who are not easily shaken. And over time, your calmness begins to influence the environment around you. Conversations become more thoughtful. Conflicts become easier to resolve. Situations that once felt chaotic begin to feel manageable. All because you have learned something simple, but powerful. You do not have to react to everything. You have the ability to pause, to observe, to choose how you respond. And that choice is one of the most powerful freedoms a person can have. Because when your reactions are no longer automatic, your life is no longer controlled by every external event. Your attention becomes intentional, your emotions become manageable, your mind becomes clear, and from that clarity comes something that many people spend their entire lives searching for. Peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from avoiding life, but the kind that comes from understanding it. The kind that comes from knowing that no matter what happens around you, you still have the ability to choose how you respond. And sometimes the most powerful response is no reaction at all. If this idea resonated with you, take a moment to reflect on the situations in your life where reactions appear most quickly. Notice them, observe them, and the next time a moment of tension appears, try something simple. Pause. Take a breath. Allow the moment to exist without rushing to react. You may be surprised how often that single pause changes the entire situation. Because the power of not reacting is not about silence or avoidance. It is about control. Control over your attention. Control over your emotions. Control over the direction of your life. And once you begin practicing that control, even in small moments, you start moving through the world differently. Calmer, clearer, and stronger than before. Thank you for spending this time reflecting with me. And until the next conversation, remember something simple. Calmness is not weakness. Calmness is power.